From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So with that, it is now my pleasure to introduce Clay Risen, who has written The Bill of the Century, The Epic Battle for the Civil Rights Act. Mr. Risen is an editor for the New York Times op-ed section and the founding editor, of the noted quarterly Democracy, a journal of ideas. His recent freelance work has appeared in such publications as The Atlantic, Smithsonian, and The Washington Post. His first book, A Nation on Fire, America in the Wake of the King Assassination, was hailed by Publishers Weekly as, quote, a crucial addition to civil rights history, unquote. Mr. Risen is also the author of, and I love this book, I've read it myself, America, Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye, a guide to the nation's favorite spirit. When I start reading a new book, I always turn to the acknowledgments first. And Mr. Risen immediately endeared himself to me when I turned to his acknowledgement page, and he leads by thanking archivists and librarians. So on behalf of librarians everywhere, thank you so much. As the Library of Congress prepares to open a major exhibit on September 10th, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, A Long Struggle for Freedom, it's especially meaningful to have Mr. Risen here today to talk about his book. The Bill of the Century documents in a most compelling manner how this act came to be. What set it apart for me from other accounts of this period is Mr. Risen's adept understanding of the legislative process. This book is a real page-turner. Even though we know how the story will turn out, you won't be able to put it down. It's now my pleasure to introduce Clay Risen.
Hello? Great. All right, so let me just get myself situated here. All right. So thank you all for being here, and thank you very much to the National Book Festival and of course, the Library of Congress. As Robert said, I could not have done this book or any of my work without librarians, archivists, but particularly from the Library of Congress. The amount of time that I spent here over on Capitol Hill, as well as on the website, doing research is just, represented a huge chunk of the work that went into this book. What I thought I would do today is, I'm not very good at just kind of talking about myself or speaking about my process. I'd really rather talk with you. So let me speak a little bit about why I wrote the book, a little bit of the work that went into it, and then really open it up to questions, and we can talk about anything that I've said or what went into what the book is about, any sort of details you want to know, reflections on what the bill means today, all that jazz, all that fun stuff. So one question that everyone asks, and we'll just get this out of the way so that you don't have to ask it, is why I wrote this book, which is a weird question. Because it's kind of like asking someone why you fell in love, right? I mean, once you've written a book and you've published it, it's hard to remember a time when you didn't work on it, even though obviously there was a time before the book. But it's hard to imagine the book not existing. It's hard to imagine that relationship not being sort of a front and center part of your life. In some similar way, maybe in a sort of a softer version of the way that you feel when you're in love. So for someone to ask, well, why did you write this book? It's sort of, well, why didn't I write this book? Why wouldn't I write this book? It's sort of, but it is a good question. And there's sort of two answers. One is a sort of obvious answer, and one is a little more personal and a little pretentious, but you'll see. So the first reason is that my first book was A Nation on Fire, and it was about the week after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there are a lot of great books about the assassination of Martin Luther King. Very few books even touch on the week that came afterward, and yet it was such an important week and so much happened during that week that I thought, well, that's a great sort of story that's sitting out in the open that needs to be told, from the violence in the streets to the politics in the White House, what it meant for society in terms of race relations, what it meant for the '68 election. At the time, Congress was debating the 1968 Fair Housing Act, also known as the '68 Civil Rights Act. So this was, an interesting time. What it was not, though, was a civil rights book. It touched on civil rights as a theme. It was a race relations book. It was an urban history book. Nevertheless, a lot of people would say to me, oh, that's a civil rights book, or it would be categorized as civil rights. And there was something, not that anyone meant anything bad by that or ill about that, but it reminded me of a way that the violence after King was killed was cast as a civil rights story. If you ask somebody like Strom Thurmond or George Wallace what the riots meant, they would say, well, that's just kind of the end result of the civil rights movement. And that was one of the lines of argument that was put forward by segregationists and critics of the movement, was this is what the civil rights process leads to. And so there was always that echo in the back of my head when people would say, well, your book is about civil rights. And it's not about civil rights. It's not about the struggle in that sense. Nevertheless, it got me thinking, it's not about that. And that's something I'd like to know more about. And as I started looking for a subject, because of course there are some great works on the civil rights movement, both popular and academic books, and more have been coming out every year. So looking for a subject, well, what is something that has a rich archival base out there that I really love archival work. That's one of the things that drives me when I look for a book project, is how big are the archives and how much time can I spend in a library, which is a really weird thing for someone to want to do, but a very valuable interest when you want to write a history book. I would say pretty much you have to have that. Everything else can kind of be by the side, but you kind of have to want to spend time. So I was sort of thinking about, well, what is out there that sort of lends itself to that? And the more I looked at the Civil Rights Act, the more I found, well, this is a subject that's also similarly out there in the open for someone to talk about, that people don't really talk about because they think they know everything about it. In the same way that people kind of thought they knew everything about the violence after King's assassination, but actually didn't, because there was nothing really out there written about it, or much discussion about it. So the Civil Rights Act, also something that I thought I could really sink my teeth into, and be something that is very personally engaging. I think anyone who writes history has to be personally engaged with the material, and yet at the same time something that would benefit the public. I didn't want to write the next book. There's no way I was going to write a biography of Martin Luther King, because I could never do as good a job as Taylor Branch or David Garrow, and even if I could, I would write another book on Martin Luther King, and that would be it. So wanted to tackle something that really hadn't been addressed yet. The other reason is more about why am I interested in civil rights in general. And and I often get this question because, frankly speaking, because I'm not an academic. I'm not an academic historian. And, I am not someone who you would necessarily assume is fascinated with civil rights. I'm an op-ed journalist at the New York Times, an editor, and what is it about that topic that gets me going? And, part of it, I grew up in Nashville, and in the 1980s, anybody who's from that generation, and not necessarily just people from Nashville, but I think in a lot of cities, if you grew up in the 80s, you sort of felt this weird kind of, I think if you reflect back on it, it's not necessarily what you felt at the time, but if you reflect back on it, it's this sort of weird kind of, almost, I don't know, hangover is the wrong word, but kind of a hangover from all the achievements made in the 60s and 70s. And I certainly look back at that and feel like there was the 80s are definitely the kind of turning point where we started to pull back from the achievements of the 60s and 70s, and people started to criticize openly and legislate and litigate against the achievements of the 60s and 70s. And that was part of the culture too. I think a certain feeling that the critical position against the civil rights movement, that civil rights had gone too far, that we've done enough, really started to take hold. And I think that in a lot of ways, in some ways that I can't quite articulate, I could sense that or I look back and it resonates with my own memories of the 80s, of just it being a racially conservative time after a racially progressive time. Even though, of course, in a lot of ways, we still saw progress on the ground, you didn't see the kind of energy behind doing more in terms of legislation or litigation. So that's kind of a general sense. Also, being in Nashville was a weird time. Not something I recognized at the moment, but when I got to college and looked back and said, Nashville is this city that, first of all, obviously it's in the South, so it has a racial history to it, like the rest of the South. But also Nashville being a very particular has a very particular story to be told. It was, a center point or a crossroads of the slave trade in up until the Civil War, and then it was occupied early on, and the Union military occupiers performed a number of sort of social experiments. I mean, there was not only in terms of race, but prostitution was legal in Nashville for several years under the military occupation, because it was a way of it was a radical plan to improve public health. So all the soldiers would visit the prostitutes, and this was a way of sort of registering them. And anyway, Nashville was a hotbed for that. Of course, then things changed, and like the rest of the region, definitely reverted back to what we came to know as Jim Crow. But then, of course, Nashville in the 60s, or in the 50s and 60s, became yet again a hotbed of civil rights activism. None of this was taught to me. I never knew that. Maybe I could have, if I had inquired, it wouldn't be hidden from me, but it wasn't something that I was taught to inquire about. One of the things that, when I think back on it, was very telling was Nashville has, like a lot of cities in the South, it has a lot of beautiful plantations, many of them from the antebellum period, and some of them are open for tours. And there's one in particular where I remember we went on the tour, and this was in high school, I guess, and someone asked, well, where are the slave quarters? Where are they? Obviously, there were slave quarters. And the tour guide, with no irony or sense of shame or really any sort of recognition of what this meant, said, oh, well, that's where the parking lot is. We didn't think that was important. And that's the attitude, right? And in some ways, it's a weird sort of unintended consequence of the civil rights movement, right? It's this ability for white America, for the white South, to say, we did that. We took care of it. So that was 0 hour, 1964, 65, 0 hour. We can move beyond, not only move beyond Jim Crow, but we can sort of assume that those problems are taken care of. We don't have to talk about the past. Let's just ignore that inconvenient history. And that's very much part and parcel of the New South attitude in general. But I think it was very, very much a reigning paradigm when I was growing up. Race simply wasn't something that you talked about in my part of Nashville. I'm sure it's very different in other places, other parts of Nashville. And I will say the city has gotten a lot better. And like a lot of the South, it's much more aware of its own history. But this was the world in which I grew up, a sort of colorless, monochromatic world where race and color and discrimination simply were not issues. They were parts of a previous history that we didn't address. So, and of course, Nashville being a relatively progressive city, a more or less mainstream city in America. Didn't have, at least when I was growing up, intense racial strife. It wasn't, there weren't the kinds of fights that you saw in places where real reactionaries still maintained control in parts of the deeper South. Nashville was progressive enough where, and to its credit, people got along. So, and generally worked things out, and so that there was no point where someone who was growing up then would necessarily learn from current events or start to learn about history through debates that were going on around them. So, and I tell this story because I think it's probably more, it's unique in some ways to Nashville and to me at the time, but also in slightly different versions of that are probably very similar. People of my generation probably had very similar experiences. They were young, just young enough to have grown up and started to recognize the world after civil rights was something that everyone talked about. So that, I think, motivated me when I went off to college and started to become more aware of who I was and what race was, and really where I, as a white American, fit within that schema. What I had to learn. There was so much that I had to learn. First of all, obviously on a factual level, I simply just did not know a lot about the history of the civil rights movement, the history of race in America. To the extent that I knew about the Civil War, it was a history told through battles, told through generals. It was not a history of what actually caused the Civil War or what African Americans and everyday people of all races experienced during the war. These were not things that were ever really taught to me. So early on, I started, more or less a sort of systematic exploration of these things and trying to learn more about my own history, both within, personally my history, where sort of Nashville was, what the history of where I had grown up was, but also generally about American history, and really settled on that period of the 50s and 60s as being something that I didn't know enough about, but also felt very compelled to learn and write about. And so identifying things that I think people of my generation need to know, were not taught about, and of course subsequent generations, I think it's probably, you'd say this as well, that this was something that I could really do something to contribute, not just to my own awareness of the world, but also to other people's awarenesses, to help them understand a little bit better what our history had been and why it continues to matter. Let me just talk a little bit about the writing process, because this is another question that people ask a lot, and just to, in case anyone was going to ask, so we'll get it out of the way. Like I said, I love archival work to the point where, if there's any weakness in my work or in this book, it's that it is, I had a deadline and I didn't do, when it came down to a decision between do I go interview somebody or do I go to the archives, it was always go to the archives. And I think, there are merits to both sides of that choice, but I find archives to be so incredibly important in terms of telling, in terms of giving you a level of depth of history, a level of depth of fact and insight that you can really start to pull apart stories that everyone thinks they know. You can find evidence that very quickly that points in other directions, that allows you to tell, it gives you the building blocks to start to construct a story that will have resonance and meaning and an argument to it. And it's your interpretation that you're bringing to that. That's kind of the shell that goes over that. When I sit down to work on a book, the first thing I do is obviously read all the secondary literature and all of the newspapers and sort of easily accessible periodical literature that's out there. One of the things that's just an amazing thing for someone of doing historical research today, the amount of the amount of database material that's out there is astounding. If you are able to get a hold of a ProQuest account, you can do a search through every newspaper article in 10 different major newspapers since, well, as far back as they go, and some of them go back to the 1850s. It's really an amazing thing. So you can get everything. And ProQuest has a number of African American newspapers, so you can get into sources that traditionally are just simply not accessible to a lot of historians, or are very hard to find, and yet contain rich amounts of insight and reporting. So that's kind of the first thing. But then also, as I'm going through these things, I start to build a list of archives that I know of and archives that I imagine exist, right? You sort of come across someone with an interesting story and you say, well, I wonder if that person has papers somewhere. One of the frustrating things, and I would really hope that someone out there is working on this, is there is no database for papers, right? So you can go to the Library of Congress and they have a great database of papers that they have, but they won't tell you what's at Yale or what's at Berkeley. You have to go find those, and there's no way to say, I want to find where John Smith's archives are. You have to really just dive in, and it can be like a needle in a haystack. And one of the ways to get at that is to rely on the work of other people. And so immediately diving into the footnotes and starting to sort of reverse engineer some of the research that people have done, and looking at, well, where are those archives? Where did someone go to get this stuff? One of the great sources, one of the great archival caches that I located, that I used, was, of all places, at the Presbyterian Historical Society, which is located in Philadelphia. Now, the Presbyterian Historical Society is a great library. It's a great archival institution. But one of the things they have is the papers of the National Council of Churches. And the NCC was integral to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. I won't go into it too much, but they were able to organize not only all the different religious groups, a real ecumenical effort, bringing in Jewish organizations and Protestant and Catholic organizations, not only at the national level, but also reaching deep into parts of the Midwest and the sort of the mountain states, where the traditional civil rights groups, groups like the NAACP and also groups that were pro-civil rights like the United Auto Workers, they really couldn't reach. You just didn't have much of a civil rights or labor presence in some of those places, but the churches could. So, and they dove into it. The NCC was very involved. So I found a reference in a book that said, referred to the NCC papers and had some very specific information that led me to go there. And a large part of the middle bit of my research efforts were just going to libraries like that. And sometimes you go and you find, oh, the only thing at that library is that one thing that person cited. That, almost literally, that's the only thing that is that's there, and that author found it. In this case, there was an enormous amount of material, great stuff. And when you're really lucky, you go to an archive, and not only do they have stuff from their organization, but they've kept stuff that they accumulated from other organizations. So the NCC had obviously all of their papers, the minutes from their meetings, correspondence between leaders of the NCC and officials within the Department of Justice, detailing on a microscopic level how the NCC coordinated with the Department of Justice to advocate, to target and lobby specific congressmen. I mean, really amazing, a great insight into how the bill happened. They had that there. So not only did they have that kind of stuff, but then they had other material. They had letters that the American Jewish Committee or the American Jewish Congress wrote to them. Letters that somehow got into their files that the AJC wrote to someone else. That's the kind of the sort of serendipity that you get when you go into the archives. And if you plan it right, you get a lot of stuff very quickly. And if you do enough of this work and you just really pound it for a long time, eventually it makes the writing process very easy because you've gone over the material. Pretty soon you start to see copies of documents that you've seen in one archive at another archive, and you start to pick this stuff up, and you start to feel like, yes, I think I've got everything. Now, I'm not saying that I got everything, but you start to feel like you have a comprehensive story that you're able to tell, that you have all that material, and if you can just put it all in an order, then the material tells itself. And I think with this book, I mean, fortunately, that's how it came down. And by the time I sat down to write it in early 2013, it just flowed out. And the material was all there, and it just, I was able to organize it pretty easily. Fortunately, it's a fairly straightforward narrative, so I was able to just put it down, and it just sort of flowed. And it was a great feeling. It was, as a journalist, I get that sometimes when I report the heck out of a story and the story just tells itself. But of course, that's when you're writing 800 words, 1,500 words. This was 100,000 words, but it just spilled, and it felt to me like a real mark of a personal achievement that it was able to just almost organize itself. One other thing I'll say, and this is more kind of on the geek level, but for anybody out there who's working on something like this, not only are online databases amazing resources, but in terms of technology, the ability these days to go into a library and not photocopy or handwrite notes, but to take a camera and with a digital camera and just take photographs of everything you can get very quickly. I mean, you can, if you do it right, you can, just be standing there with a camera and flip pages and you create a little sort of schema or rubric for organizing. Libraries love it because it means that fewer people have to touch the documents, right? You don't have to now have someone else take them, photocopy them. They don't have to pay someone to photocopy them. They don't have to pay for a photocopier. The library at the Lyndon Johnson Museum and Archives in Austin, they actually have stands. They have stands and cameras, and they'll even give you a CD. They'll burn it onto a CD-ROM for you. This is what they want you to do, and it's great because then instead of spending weeks at an archive, you can spend a week or a couple of days even, and then go back and look at it at your leisure. And even better, and this is a trick that it really just made the difference for me, and it was a big difference between writing my first book, which was 6-7 years ago, and writing this book, is that now you can take, let's say you have 100 pages in a particular file, you take those, you can turn those 100 JPEGs into one PDF, take that PDF and load it onto your a PDF reader on your iPad or your pad of choice, and then I don't endorse products, but I have an iPad. I think it's a pretty cool device, so maybe I do endorse it. And these programs, these apps, I mean, a lot of them will let you can then just annotate it. So you flip through and you can annotate it as you go. And I've talked to some historians, some older historians who just, some of them are a little wary of this. Just they're wary of technology. They're wary of doing that, the hardcore reading, not of the actual document, but of a photo image of it. And I think some of that sentimentality. Some people really they have to be sitting there taking notes by hand in order for it to feel real. And I get that. That's fair. But I actually think it's better from it allows you to be a more accurate and I think more incisive historian. Because when you have to leave everything at the library, I mean, even if you photocopied it, photocopying is expensive, and you come away with a black and white copy. You can't come away with nearly as many pages as you can if you photograph it. So immediately you're taking, you're coming away with less material than you probably need. You already have to make choices about what you can't read, what you have to leave behind. You also one thing that I think is really cool, particularly when you're doing work in the 60s, probably up until, through today, is people are, is color. Color makes a difference. You don't think about this until you actually sit down with the pages. But when you have a photocopy, you can't see the color, different ink colors. And you might not be able to tell that two different people made comments, right? You can't, when you have a color image of a document, you can actually see, you can carry it around with you and see what it really looks like. And you can get immediately, oh, these are two different sets of comments. You can see, say if it was relevant, you can see a coffee stain. You can see these things that make the document more material to you. And I think allows you, at your leisure, to assess that document instead of having to sort of take a look at it, move on, take a note, because that's all the time you have for it at the library. So this, but for me, this is a huge boon, because then you can actually do that research. You can take that time that you would spend in a library and parcel it out over 100 trips back and forth to work on the train, which is what I did. And so I have a 45-minute commute to work, 45 minutes each way. I have a 90 minutes each day, to just sit and read pages. And so you can suddenly go through thousands of pages in a month instead of having to cram that into a trip, a very expensive trip over time, to Missoula, Montana, to see the Mike Mansfield papers, which are, Missoula, wonderful place, but you want to travel all the way to Missoula to and rent a car and stay in a hotel for 3 weeks, because Mike Mansfield has a lot of papers. I tell you, his papers, wonderful collection of papers, but that is a hike. So it just makes everything more efficient. And I think it's wonderful right now to be a historian working in this field, because it's in some ways a field that you would not imagine would be very sensitive or let's say elastic in response to technology. That history would kind of be the thing that it's basically be done the same way that it's always done, or history writing. And in fact, I think it's very different. And I can, if anyone's, I don't have to go on further, but if anyone's interested in talking more about this, it's one of those things where I just really like to geek out about, oh wow, this app, or talking about how to do this process, because it's very exciting to me. So with that, let me just change my stance completely and open the floor to questions, because what I have not done today really is talk about the book at all. And it's, which I know is why you're probably here. But always, they'd asked us at the beginning, please don't give a talk, a lecture, which is actually normally what I do. And so it's easy to give a lecture. It's kind of hard to just sit up and talk about the bill, because it's a very big thing. It's a big topic, and there are a lot of things that are interesting about it to me. I would rather, given the opportunity, talk to you about what interests you as far as the bill goes, or about writing books or whatever. So with that, let me just throw open the floor and hear what you have to say.
Thank you for your comments about the process, but I am interested in the content of the book. And I would very much like to know what conclusions and insights did you draw as a result of the research, and what revelations or surprises did you gain in the process of this?
It's a great question. I would say there are a lot. There are two things that I would highlight that I think surprised me, or not so much surprised me, but were not things I expected when I went in. The first is the role that Lyndon Johnson played. There is a traditional story that says that the bill was Lyndon Johnson's bill. And obviously that's not true, because he wasn't president when it was introduced. It was John F. Kennedy was president. And by the time Johnson came into office after Kennedy's assassination, the bill had been in Congress and the House for several months. So obviously there's a story before that story. I think Johnson made a critical contribution to the bill. But I think that his contribution is often misunderstood. People, without really any evidence, assume that Johnson's contribution was to move the bill very aggressively in the back rooms and to get to twist arms and to pull people who did not want to agree to come together to make the bill happen. Some of that did happen. That there were moments when Johnson did that. But what's more remarkable is how little of that happened, given what we know about how Johnson worked on other pieces of legislation. Johnson was, I'd say that his more important contribution was, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, was symbolic, in the sense that what Johnson did was to stand up in every opportunity that he had in public and to push the bill and to push Congress to pull the bill forward and to challenge them not to leave, and basically to say, I'm not going to let you leave until you pass the bill, and not just any bill, but the strongest possible bill, or the bill as it exists. The bill, by the time it got to the Senate, was much stronger than it was when it was introduced by Kennedy. It didn't have a Title VII Equal Employment Opportunity Commission when it was introduced by Kennedy. It did by the time Johnson came to office. So Johnson, to call for no compromise, that was a big deal. But instead of that kind of top-down led story, what I found was something that was much more complex, involved, yes, the White House, but also the Department of Justice, oftentimes acting not against each other at all, but acting with some degree of independence from each other. A variety of players in the House and in the Senate who were absolutely vital in both parties, absolutely vital. One thing that I found that I thought was interesting was the relatively it's not that the Southern Democrats were not a problem. I mean, their filibuster was defined the story of the bill in the Senate. But so much of the story of the bill, I think, is how the coalition that supported the bill came together and agreed on what the bill should be about throughout its course, both within Congress, within the executive, and in the civil rights community. So that, I think, is somewhat different, a somewhat different story than what I expected when I went in. The other is that there's a certain irony to the bill that I referred to earlier, and it's the fact that, and of course this isn't to fault the bill at all, but the fact that it was so successful and the fact that it was such a landmark piece of legislation that it banned Jim Crow. I mean, it's amazing to think that it legislated it outlawed what was largely a social arrangement. There were parts of the South that certainly had by law segregation, but it was also just it was an accepted part of Southern culture that white business owners could discriminate against African Americans. This bill outlawed that. That's amazing. But the fact that it was so aggressive and it was so successful gave room to a lot of people, not just in the South, but around the country, to say, okay, we did it. And this, in combination with the Voting Rights Act, I think created a better America, but also one that was able to rest on its laurels and say, we don't have to deal with the other, frankly, much more challenging questions that surround race in terms of de facto segregation, in terms of police violence, things that, as we all know, we're still dealing with today. And in some ways, we didn't address those because we felt like we had done enough. And I think that's just, that's a consequence, it's an unavoidable consequence of landmark legislation. And I think you can find that same story with other pieces of landmark legislation in history. But it's an irony that it's not that I didn't think it would be there, it's that I just hadn't even considered that as being a defining part of the bill. But I think is also something very important to understand about, how legislation and sort of the public and society interact. So those would be two things.
So thank you for writing the book. As someone who works on social advocacy, I found a comprehensive narrative to be really important. And one of the great myths amongst people who do the line of work that I do is a level of cohesiveness and coordination amongst the grassroots effort to push the bill through and to apply pressure on elected officials. And I'm just wondering, in your reading of the history and your understanding of the history, if you could give a brief overview in terms of your understanding in terms of that sort of coordination or lack of coordination amongst the grassroots.
Yeah, it was amazing. It's one of the stories that I really try to emphasize in the book is that there was almost a golden age of social activism that we don't think of. When we think of the 60s, we think in social activism, we think of the late 60s. But really the activism that came together particularly around civil rights in the early 60s was astounding. And so you have the civil rights groups as a core, but labor came together as well. As I mentioned, church groups and ecumenical in the sense of being, not just your sort of typically socially engaged Catholic and Jewish groups, but also a number of Protestant groups that until then had been kind of standoffish. And around the country, you had at a high point during the filibuster, you had churches that would on a regular basis. You had churches in Topeka or in Denver having weekly meetings after the sermon or after the service to talk about civil rights and what was going on and to do letter writing campaigns. It's something that we lost somehow. I think the 60s fractured that because it introduced, it simply brought to a fore questions that splintered that coordination. The war was obviously very divisive, split all sorts of groups that had previously coordinated. It's something that I think when anyone thinks about social activism today, they have to look at that period and say, how were they able to come together? And part of it is because civil rights was just such a pressing issue at the time. We just haven't had many things that were that pressing. The war, Vietnam War, may be one of them. But it's hard to think of something that quite rises to that level. And yet, I think anybody looking to achieve that kind of broad-based grassroots activism needs to look at that time and take lessons from it. So, yes, David.
As Clay Risen knows, I'm David Cohen, and I had a chance to lobby on that 64 Act and the legislations that followed. I'm very appreciative of what you wrote because for the reasons you've said when you've discussed the content of the bill, and just a quick point on the social activism, some of that actually came from the South of African Americans and white people together, often lobbying some of those Midwestern senators and when they couldn't lobby their own senators. So that was a very creative example of social activism. I very much appreciate the kind of credit you gave to people like William McCulloch, who was the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, and Senators Humphrey and Mansfield, and would only suggest that possibly more emphasis could be made on the role that Richard Bowling played on the House Rules Committee. And I'd like you to reflect on one point. Title VI, which banned discrimination in federal spending, was a significant act, a significant title with enormous impact later on. You mentioned that in referencing school segregation. Reflect a little on why this was not a hot legislative issue in the legislation. It was not something that we battled over. Much to my surprise, it stayed in, and it stayed in rather uncontroversially.
Yeah, well, I think at the time, so Title VI, very briefly, said federal money cannot go to fund programs that discriminate. So if a state has, or let's say a school district discriminates, segregates, it cannot get federal money. Now, I think, at the time, the debate that did occur was largely around, look, most of the federal money let me pull it back. The way that Title VI was written only applied to a relatively small number of federal programs at the time. so that when people looked at it and they looked at what federal programs are out there, they said, that's not that big of a deal. Agriculture programs were affected, highway programs were affected. People generally, were okay with that. I agree with you. I'm surprised that there wasn't more attention paid to it for those reasons. And as I remember, if I'm right, it was Nick Katzenbach, who was the Deputy Attorney General, had said he was perfectly willing to throw that away, that was something that he, if it came to it, was very willing to compromise on, and yet it never happened. One of the ironies is that it was a sleeper provision. The next year, the government started, through the Great Society, rolling out federal outlays, huge amounts of federal money going to the states in terms of healthcare, in terms of education spending, and none of that money could go to a state or to a program that discriminated. So suddenly you had this huge incentive. Set aside everything else. You cannot get money if your program discriminates. Well, pretty quickly people stopped discriminating. And Title VI, I think, when you look back at it, was one of the most important, one of the most effective parts of the bill. It was not something that anyone would have said about it when it was being debated.
Thank you.
I guess one more question?
Thank you. That was very helpful to hear. As an author publicist, I know I should be asking you about your book, but I just can't resist asking you about something else, if I can. So I'm from Nashville, and I had the good fortune of growing up in a household that was very involved in the civil rights movement. So I did get to ask a lot of questions and a lot of education and on that, but still learning, 49 still learning. I think what I would be interested in hearing you say something about is, I'm thinking about just democracy in general and in this country, elsewhere, but particularly in this country, and the sort of the things that I think we need to be thinking about when we think about democracy. And so as I think about the civil rights movement, and I think today about what they call the cradle to prison pipeline, I just wondered if you think much about that, if you've read much about it, but just as we think about democracy, what do you think about when you think about that cradle to prison pipeline?
I mean, one of the things that, let's say the necessary compromises in the bill that were there before the bill was even written was a rejection or a decision not to include anything that focused really on the economic situation of African Americans, right? There was a decision made that was considered, jobs programs, all sorts of things were considered as part of the bill. I mean, this was before it was even introduced. This is just in the White House, people debating these things. And there was a feeling like we can just, that's too much. Let's just set that aside. But there was definitely an understanding that, look, this bill has to be just the first step toward things. And that, yes, we have to tackle Jim Crow, we have to tackle job discrimination, we have to tackle voting, but those need to be just the first move towards something else, right? Well, let's create the legal basis for inclusion, for democratic inclusion, but let's understand that economic inclusion has to be part of that those are not separable. And yet, I think, to reference what I said earlier, because there was sort of this resting on our laurels, moving on, whatever, of our politics, we never addressed that. So we ended up saying, well, okay, we've achieved legal equality on a certain level. We have the Civil Rights Act, we have the Voting Rights Act, and we see these other things as separate and somehow less important. And so I think 50 years later, that cradle to prison dynamic is what we have. That's a consequence of it. So, yeah.
It was interesting around that social activism. I heard in Congressman Lewis's talk about, somebody asked, what do you think we need now? And his staffer who was with him just spoke up and said, we need a modern day SNCC. And
fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. But I would really like to thank everybody for coming out. This was a lot of fun to talk. I hope it was interesting. And thank you again to the Library of Congress and the National Book Festival. This was a real pleasure.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.